Hi, Sam here. I'm joined again by Mark and Emma. We'll be discussing the next two parts of Introduction to Christianity, Belief in the World of Today, and the ecclesiastical form of faith tonight. And I'll just go over to Mark here, and he's going to read a segment that we're going through.
Yeah, so since we're talking about belief, there's a Jewish story that Ratzinger relates in here that I think encapsulates most of what the chapter is about. An adherent of the Enlightenment, a very learned man who had heard of the rabbi of Berdichev, paid a visit to him in order to argue, as was his custom, with him too, and to shatter his old-fashioned proofs of the truth of his faith. When he entered the rabbi's room, he found him walking up and down with a book in his hand, wrapped in thought. The rabbi paid no attention to the new arrival. Suddenly he stopped, looked at him fleetingly, and said, "But perhaps it is true, after all." The scholar tried in vain to collect himself. His knees trembled. So terrible was the rabbi to behold, and so terrible his simple utterance to hear. But Rabbi Levi Yitzhak now turned to face him and spoke quite calmly. "My son, the great scholars of the Torah with whom you have argued wasted their words on you. As you departed, you laughed at them. They were unable to lay God and his kingdom on the table before you, and neither can I. But think, my son, perhaps it is true." The exponent of the Enlightenment opposed him with all his strength, but this terrible perhaps that echoed back at him time after time broke his resistance. Now, when I read that, I was like, wow. The first time. I had to put down the book. Just one of those instances. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah. So, so as I understand, Mark, you're someone who you haven't always identified as a person of faith, let alone a Christian.
Not even close.
So, I guess, was there a moment or was there something that broke you or where you felt like, oh man, God's really moving in this place or at this time? Or,
I remember the time I admitted it for the first time, and I spoke it out loud in the car to my wife, and I started crying because I realized what it all meant to accept it. I wasn't happy about it. I definitely, like, the terrible perhaps did haunt me for a long time. I can distinctly remember getting to the platonic, first mover, and then that was really difficult to move from there. But once I got there, it was an inevitable path that just kind of went down, 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 further and further. But it was actually very disturbing. Um, I wasn't prepared for what it would entail, and I knew it would entail a lot, and I didn't like that. I was quite happy in my sins for the most part. I'll just say that I was not prepared to give them up, and it's been a huge battle. But man, that terrible perhaps just haunted me.
so you said that your wife was there at the time, so this was in the context of a conversation you were having with her.
We were driving back from the mall at night, probably, I want to say around maybe November, because I remember it was dark, and it gets dark really early up here during November. And it was just like this dam broke, and I had to say it. I couldn't go on anymore. She'd found a few days before the Bible that had been hiding in my desk because she saw me put it away. And eventually that conversation went forth because there was a lot of tension after that. I didn't really want to talk. Um, the hound of heaven just finally got me at that point.
Yeah. In general, do you feel like you're someone who you can easily talk about faith or ideas, or do you think it's something that's a second language or something that's difficult for you?
I think it's definitely difficult, especially difficult with my family.
Hmm.
Like, strangers are one thing, family's another. They're far closer to you, and they can hurt you far more.
Yeah.
It's not even the hurt; it's the almost the risk of feeling like you might lose them.
Hmm.
Um, and that haunting echo of Christ, he who does not hate his mother and his father, like you're worried that, yeah, I'm gonna right at the beginning have to go through this sort of deal. Although my parents actually were very either nonplussed or pleased. My dad was pleased. My dad was pleased despite him not going to mass for 40 years. Um, actually, his first
It's funny
mass.
how that goes
Go ahead.
sometimes. It's funny how that goes sometimes. My husband had kind of a similar experience when he told his parents he was converting from Protestantism to Catholicism. Because his dad had always thought of himself as Catholic, even though he hadn't been to Mass in like 30 years.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. I mean, I didn't realize until that day, actually, that my dad had a statue of Fatima in every car he's ever owned, despite not really believing, not being identified that way. But he's always kept this statue of Fatima. It's just this little metal thing, right? Like maybe this big. And he's been in so many absolutely horrid car accidents and walked away. So he just takes this thing with him, and you just don't know people, right? They're walking enigmas for the most part.
Yeah. So, yeah, I guess with the book today, so the main section that we're going over, it is about, I guess, I believe. So we joked about it before. Ratzinger really goes deep on two words, or if you shorted it to credo, really one word. And so I think it's probably fair to say he talks mostly about the second part of that, believe. So, and one of the things that struck me in thinking about it is that it is interesting how the Apostles' Creed and Christianity in general, it places the I at the center. So it's different than like the Shema, where it's Hear, O Israel, or the, I don't even know the proper name for it, but the creedal statement of Islam, where it's there is no God but Allah, where it's just a factual or propositional statement. So it places the drama and the importance at the center of the person. So, and yeah, that so I don't. I guess what stuck out to the two of you in reading through the passage. Obviously, there was a story of the rabbi and the whisper of perhaps that Ratzinger talks about, and it is it is a good analogy or a good example of the idea of sort of embodied spirituality that he talks about, and the importance and how, yeah, in Christianity, God is, well, he's invisible, but he's also visible in the um, person of Christ. And then also the Christian properly belongs to a church or a creed, right? Too. That's another thing that he gets into in the second part of what we'll go over today. So,
So I don't know if you want to go first, Emma, or
Go for it.
so I mentioned, I think, this last time that I've read the book before. Read, right? I went through it audio because usually audiobooks are cheaper if you have an Audible subscription. Um, and it was funny going through this section on belief, where the first thing that struck me is I remembered the moment that I knew I had to read the book in person as opposed to listen to it, is when he goes over the statement that the essence of belief is the assertion that the world does not end at your senses, and that the unseen is what holds up the seen ultimately. And I remember hearing that. I was standing at the bus station at like 7 in the morning, waiting for my bus, thinking, wow, dang, that's it, isn't it? That's the whole thing. This is going to be dense. But that one got me really, because you hear belief so trite, like, oh, I believe it. I believe what does that even mean, right? Like
Mhm.
one of the PVK, like, what does that mean? it's it's particularly poignant for me because when he goes over the section about positivism, right? Um, that the skeptic is always at risk of losing his skepticism. The deeper he goes, the worse it gets, right? In that way, it's almost an inverse where belief is an act of the will. It has to start from basically trust. And the more that you go into that, the deeper and more faithful you get, actually. It starts to make even more sense. Where I remember being in philosophy of science class where we went over issues with science. And at the time, I couldn't quite understand what was going on until later on in my life now, when I'm looking back, like, oh, that's what Thomas Kuhn was going over. That's what Willard Quine was describing. And that's why you need something like a web of belief, because it starts to make more sense that way, right? There's so many problems with the fact as the central point of life. That really resonated with me because I understood being the skeptic losing his skepticism.
Yeah. So, yeah, the phrase that struck me was that he talks about belief as a mode of access. So the exact phrase I have here is man seeks a second mode of access to reality. Mode, let's see, actually, I don't think I put that properly in there. So, but basically, he talks about belief is something that takes a person out of themselves. So, and yeah, turning away from human nature. And I guess it's one of those things is whatever you think of belief or however you characterize it, it always involves something beyond you, right? So even if it's something as simple as I believe I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning and I'm going to go to work, or and so and then if you're talking about it in the Christian context, the belief or the credo is something that sort of calls a person to God. So, and he talks about belief as conversion or turning away in several segments.
Yeah, I think I wrote here, conversion is literally to turn back. That man has to turn back from his tendency to be drawn to the visible. And that's where that act of the will comes in to make the unseen primary. Right? The credo supports and molds all that follows it, which, funny enough, leads into that Vervaekeism about his 4 Ps, right? Where propositions are the beginning and they mold all that comes afterwards, right? Which I wouldn't have known without, there's someone linked me a very helpful Google document that actually spelled it out. Which I found it interesting that Ratzinger is basically saying the same thing that Vervaeke is, just almost 40 years earlier, or 50 years earlier.
I saw a lot of parallels, actually. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, go on. Let's chart it out.
Well, he talks a lot about the participatory in the second chapter, the ecclesiastical.
I haven't gotten there yet, because I thought we were just reading chapter 1.
I thought we were doing both. But in general, that one talks about, I think it comes up in the first one too. He talks about how originally the creed was just the formula for baptism that you said while you were getting baptized. And so it was part of your participation in the church and the whole church coming together. And that, I felt, had a lot of sort of Vervaeke parallels and kind of breaks it out of we think about the creeds as these like purely propositional statements. But I don't know how accurate that actually is.
Do either of you remember your baptism, or am I the only one?
No,
Not really. Yeah.
I was a month old.
Yeah.
I was, what year is it? I was 30 or 31, sorry. So I remember it very well. Uh, it was during COVID, and it wasn't exactly what I would have almost wanted it to be, because all like the right of election, I didn't get to do. They weren't holding it because it was COVID, so
Right.
I didn't get that privilege of going down to Notre Dame, Ottawa, right, which is a beautiful cathedral. Um, but the whole experience was great. And
Was it 2021
is that what it was? I think it was
or was it 2020?
not 2020.
So then, okay. So the same year that my husband got confirmed,
Oh,
Easter 2021.
to be fair, I got confirmed too.
Mhm.
Confirmed, communion, baptism, all at once.
He'd already been baptized,
Yeah, no, he did.
but
I
he
did.
he hit communion and confirmation.
But yeah, there's definitely a sense of being brought together, right? Because
Mhm.
at least for me, being a catechumen, which is what they've been mostly done for the most part, adults, um, there's definitely that communal aspect and participating in it. That now I've watched several other people go through it because I've helped um, run RCIA at the parish. So
Nice.
yeah, I know, right? They're like, oh, you've converted and you seem to know what's going on, so you also get to teach it. Yeah, it's like PVK said, if you put your hand up, you're gonna get put to work.
Mhm.
So, and then that participatory switches to perspectival now, because I know both positions of both the sponsor, the teacher, and the candidate or the catechumen. Right? It's so impactful in that way, in that you get to take part in this ritual that I don't know where else you get that anymore, if at all. Right? I know it's one thing I'm looking forward to when my kids are old enough that they'll have to go through first communion, confirmation, even first confession, right? All of
Mhm.
that is rituals inculcating you into the community, and the idea of it being that's what we do here. I mean, even Sam, like if you're going to have a believer's baptism, I'm sure that's a pretty big rite of passage for a lot of Protestant kids,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, it could be terrifying. Well, I don't know. Do they have to make statements or something? Like I've heard people do that.
I mean, there's not necessarily a formal structure that, yeah, most churches follow. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. There's not a universal structure that believers' baptism necessarily follows, but it usually, a lot of times, it does involve some kind of testimony or a statement or something like that. Um,
And I actually wanted to pick up on that. It's not what's it called? A completely propositional thing, the creed, because it touched
Mhm.
on something that Newman gets at. Because I've been reading Newman's essay on doctrine at the same
Ooh,
time,
nice.
and he goes into how the developments of most things are a back and forth between the propositional and the world encountering it, and that it's not entirely just written on paper and someone worked it out. It happens in real time as an experience in the world, and that's
Oh
kind of how
yeah,
it
he
gets put
talked about
together.
that a lot.
yeah.
Mhm.
So
Ratzinger talked about that a lot too.
yeah, so he talks about different, I guess, forms or models of belief. And so the first one he talks about, well, so he talks about, I guess, when the gulf between belief and unbelief. And one thing he talks about is the distance between the visible and the invisible, but then also the distance between, as he says it, the then and the now. So the medieval or the scholastic form for belief or model for thinking about belief is the logos. So I guess with that, so he presents two other ones. So he presents the factum, and then he also presents, I'm not going to try and say the Latin word, but the concept of feasibility or practicability.
Is that the
Technic-
faciendum?
Faciendum? Okay.
Faciendum.
All right. So, okay.
We'll go ecclesiastical here.
Okay. So,
We're not
so
doing
with
W's.
that,
Oh,
so
sorry, 1 second. I gotta go. I'll be back.
okay. Should we pause it? I guess we will. Okay, so yeah, so with the logos, one of the things I was thinking about, I don't quite grasp that as well as the other two forms of belief or ways of thinking about reality. So I was thinking, so Emma, you teach students, and I assume with Greek, the concept of logos is something that you talk at least a little bit about. I guess how would you explain that, or how would you word it?
Okay, so I've never taught Greek. I teach mythology. But as far as my understanding of like the Greek logos goes, and then expanding it out into philosophy, it's the concept of, literally it means word, but it also includes like reason, and then it can also include like rationality or knowability. So like I think how Ratzinger is using it here is like viewing things through the logos is viewing the world as knowable, not just actable or testable, but like something we can understand. And something that we understand in some way through the person of Jesus.
Yeah. So, yeah, in the last line of the first part there, the chapter 1, he uses meaning as the synonym for logos. So, and yeah, so I guess I'll just go ahead and read it. So, so the phrase is, I believe in you, Jesus of Nazareth, as the meaning logos of the world and of my life. So he puts, so I guess I guess what I put in my notes was logos is truth as the meaning of being. So, or maybe you could say experiential is how I sort of came across it. But he also, but it's clearly, I guess it's embodied in a way, but it's also maybe in some ways more than, it's not purely a idiosyncratic or individualistic interpretation of truth, the way factum and facetum are interpreted as I read it.
Yeah, you know what? The part that struck me of that whole dichotomy between the three stages of the eternal, the past to the future, that really got me. And that kind of helps me to, I guess, come to terms with what he's talking about. That in the beginning, you start with, you can get to truth through the logos because you participate in that which actually holds up the world, which is the eternal logos, right? So our own minds are primary because they're part of the divine mind in the ultimate stretch. And then you go down, I think it says, I couldn't remember the name of the Italian guy, but I wrote down Vico, if that's even the way to say it.
Giambattista Vico.
Right, there you go. Oh, where did I put him in these notes? All we can know are facts, right? That, but fact is eternally in the past, right? It always has happened. And then you can't actually verify it until you do it again, which leads into that going into the future as being the hope. as being the only way to understand things is we orient ourselves towards that, right? The goal, the actionable, the techne, as he says. And techne eventually usurps, in a Pajovian sense, the periphery becomes the center, right? That which is holding up everything is actually inverted to be on the periphery again, which was one of those weird connections that I hadn't really considered. Because, like, inherently, the scientific method is the past. It's always verifying the past. But then the truth is eternal. That doesn't seem to immediately leap out to me, but it makes sense when Ratzinger goes through it that way. Again, asserting the primacy of the unseen, but in a way that allows us to stand upon something, even though we can't see it.
Yeah, so what I have in my notes for factum is the conception is I understand something that is provable if I know the proof. So the idea being that the ability to understand or the ability to comprehend is based on your ability to formulate I guess, a positive statement. So, and I guess one of the quotes of Ratzinger that I thought of when I was reading that was truth is not the fulfillment of a positive. So, in that sense, I mean, truth is more about pointing people towards something beyond themselves and to some kind of knowability that ultimately brings them to I guess, to the good, you could say. So, like he talks about how factum and facetum interact, where um, they're related. So but they're not exactly the same. Where facetum is what is repeatable, right? So what can be demonstrated, and it doesn't necessarily ask, well, is this something that should be done, or is it something we should be thinking about? I definitely thought when page 66 he talks about cybernetics and some of the discussions that are going on around AI and other things, where the idea is that it becomes about planability or the future, and what the future is almost kind of secondary to the idea of can this be done. So, and yeah, it's definitely something to think about. So, but I think his point is that related to the creed and to Christian belief, as I understood it, is so. I mean, the creed contains facts, right? And it has it is feasible in the sense that it is logical, but when you recite the creed, you're not either reciting a proof or putting forward a proposition that's been tested. You're doing something else, a third thing, as it were. So,
does it contain facts or does it contain truths?
I mean, is the fact portion like, he was born to Mary? That's a fact, right? Or he died.
Theoretically, it's like verifiable.
Yeah, there are facts in it. I mean, he does touch on that, right? That you can reconcile theology to the factum actually pretty well, right? Because Christianity is a historical thing.
I think he talks about that being unique to Christianity too, with how historical it is.
Yeah, I think he calls it Christian positivism, the rooting of the faith in historical. Because it's just, it is. It all flows from the event, right? It's not so much that, back to Newman, it's not that someone just sat down and wrote out all these proofs to get there. No, there was an event that occurred, and then all the time after that is trying to explicate the event more and more deeply so that we understand what happened, right? It's that it's a development that occurs as a result of a fact, which points to a truth, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I think just thinking about the like facts versus truths distinction is just interesting to me here. Because we think of them as interchangeable, but they're not. And that's part of the point he's making, I think. Also, can I go on a grammar tangent, or would that be just intolerably boring?
Go.
No, go for it.
I tried reading
Okay.
Grammar of Assent, so maybe you'll do a better job.
I want to read that. It's like coming up on my list. Okay, so we've got factum and faciendum, and these are they're two forms of the same word. They both come from the verb for do, pharaoh. So factum is the past tense noun. So it's something that has been done. And that's why he talks about it as like it's been established, it's what's been tested. That's all factum. Faciendum is what can be done or what will be done. So that's where the feasibility comes from. And I just thought it might be useful to point out that those two are like the same word in different forms. And that's what he's playing with here.
Or is it a corruption?
What do you mean?
Like from factum to faciendum in terms of an organized, like trying to understand the world, right? Is the faciendum inevitably downstream from the factum? Like, is that inescapably a development that happens?
I think it's not inescapably, but it's like it makes sense that you would want to try. It follows. I don't think it's inherently a corruption. Cuz like science works, right? Like we industry works, we can make things based on having studied things. But when you try to apply that to like economics or politics, it doesn't work as well because people are way more complicated than particles in ways that economists and politicians never want to admit.
Yeah, there's soft
and
sciences.
That's the whole problem. That's the whole problem with economics is they're like, we can just set aside all these other things so that the numbers work. And the real world never matches the numbers. And then they're all confused.
And the world's the one at fault, not the numbers. No.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, it's not that we ignored that people are human so that our numbers worked. It's that people should stop being human so that they just operate according to the numbers.
Why won't you do what's rational?
Exactly.
I mean, that's really actually what it is, right? That's almost like the definition of ideological possession somehow, is trying to make the world fit what your model is. No matter what the model is, it's trying to impose that versus, well, it recognizing that it is in fact fake. It's a simplification of what's going on. We call them soft sciences, but they're soft in the fact that you can't map it out. They're actually incredibly difficult to get right.
Education is kind of a soft science too, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. Right? I mean, what is the best educational style? I don't know. I think I have some weird attachment to whatever they do at Oxford or some of the public schools in England. I think that's probably pretty great. I mean, there were at least some boys who thought it was awful enough that the war was better than the public school. Those who don't know, public school in the UK is private school in the rest of the world. That means you pay for it, right?
They're the fancy, expensive schools.
Yeah, it's public in that
it's very confusing.
Yeah, it was public in that it meant to equip you for public service, right? That was the point of the calling that. And then there's this, I guess that was before the idea of public funding, really. Right?
Yeah, I think it was before the idea of like government funded public schools even really entered the general consciousness.
So that wording just remains. But that's a side tangent. But yeah, education totally is soft science, right?
Mm-hmm.
And almost you can see there, the more that we attempt to impose a model on the world, which seems to be what they're doing sometimes in education, as far as I can tell from the outside.
It's often what people are doing in education.
Yeah, why won't the circles fit into the square holes? I don't get it. This hole is square. Why can't they be square?
Mm-hmm.
Like that totally is it. But what do you make of that? Like, I don't know, Sam or Emma, that he says that while you can reconcile Christianity to the factum, you cannot entirely to the fasciendum. What do you make of that?
Do you have like where that is?
I should have wrote down more than I just have what it says. I don't have where it is. It's towards the end of the section on belief. So we'll get there pretty quickly. No, I should have marked it off. I just wrote down in a note.
No worries. Just sometimes it helps me to think through things when I like read them again.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see if I can see it, and it's not popping out to me. Yeah, I just know that he says it in there, and that you can never reduce Christianity to just action in the world of what can be done. It's just not something that it's amenable to, in the final analysis, at least. Right? It's concerned with something more important.
So, yeah, so perhaps this gets at the thought a little bit, and I think it also gets into the idea that the interrelationship between factum and the creed, where so belief in the sense intended by the creed is not an incomplete kind of knowledge, an opinion that subsequently can or should be converted into practical knowledge. It is much rather an essential different kind of intellectual attitude, which stands alongside practical knowledge as something independent in particular and cannot be traced back or deduced from it.
Because it's definitely about grounding you, right? Like he says, it's you stand and then you understand, right? You can only understand once you're standing somewhere.
So I think one of the things he talks about, though, very briefly, is sort of two temptations, I guess, of the responding with belief to modernity. And one is the temptation, the idea of reducing belief to analogy or metaphor. So, like Christ's being risen is a metaphor for the newness of life. And of course it is, but it's not only a metaphor. It also contains a certain amount of fact and reality. But then the other part that he talks about is the idea of sort of I guess what PVK might call the fundamentalist response, the idea of trying to basically argue for the creed on solely factual grounds, or which, I mean, it's not to say that I don't get the sense that he thinks apologetics in the sort of, I don't know, I guess kind of the Protestant sense of trying to deduce, I guess, a proof from the faith is completely worthless, but I think he also clearly thinks it's insufficient.
He's definitely on the make Christianity weird again.
Yeah,
train, right?
I definitely got that. So, yeah, so when he started out with the chapter with the story of Kierkegaard, one of the terms he uses that really struck out to me was intellectual costume. So the idea is, so he seems to be, so there's a lot going on in the story. So the story is there for, if there's anyone who hasn't read it, there's a clown, and he goes into a village and he tries to warn the village of a coming fire. But because of the way he's dressed, the people in the village perceive it as a promotion for a circus or a kind of an act. So I guess in the story, one thing that happens is that the primary problem is what the messenger is wearing or how they're presenting themselves. So if you take that as an analogy for faith, then the idea is you only have to update or modernize faith, and then you've fixed the problem, right? And it's kind of interesting. I was thinking this was, so we talked about this maybe a little bit. So the book was written in 68. So it would be, I guess this year, it would be 56 years old. So did I get that right? 56? Or yeah, 56 years old. So with that, it it's before a lot of, I guess, what you could think of as sort of modern sort of seeker-friendly Christianity and revivalism and those kinds of things. But yeah, he's definitely very much saying that, yeah, the idea of keep Christianity weird is there, and it's something that's really in a lot of other of Ratzinger's work too. But then I guess the other thing in the story that he critiques is that it also places the messenger in a position of knowledge and the people receiving the message in a place of ignorance. So he also thought that that was an insufficient way to talk about faith. Whereas I guess in his thinking, the truth is that both a believer and a skeptic are probably both somewhere along a spectrum in their distance from God and their distance from belief.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing with that, the seeker sensitive versus making it completely fundamental. There was I don't know if either of you watched the Chris Williamson, Eric Weinstein conversation. But towards the third part of the interview, like the last hour, they have this long conversation about prayer and belief. And you can just see Chris Williamson almost like get his back up, like, because Eric asked him, "Do you pray?" And he's like, I meditate. That's about as close as I'm going to get." Right? There's this immediate reaction, and what came to me was the theologian is clown, right? That sort of language to a lot of people feels outdated. It feels not up to the times. It's not therapeutic. It's not scientific. It's claiming to be something completely different. In a way that meditation doesn't, right? You can somehow work that in to the fact-based ideal, where prayer is something different. It's tapping into you're tapping into a person, right? You're talking to someone relationally versus I'm tapping into the force, which is more or less what I think a lot of people view meditation as doing, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, or just sometimes meditation is also just like being with yourself and getting used to yourself.
Yeah,
They'll
go on,
view it
chart
that
that out.
way.
What do you mean?
Just all the like mindfulness meditation things I've seen. It's usually just like get to know yourself, like take a catalog of like how you feel about different things. Like it's very like inward focused and very you focused. You don't need to reach out to anything else. You're not calling on any sort of like, it doesn't even require like a spiritual world to exist. It's just like spending more time consciously thinking about things that usually happen automatically. So it can be made very scientific and very provable.
Yeah. You know what came to my mind? The curving in upon oneself, right? It's like almost a corruption of prayer in that way. I know it's not, but it feels that way, right? When we're talking about it from this perspective of talking to the divine, right? And actually reaching out to, Bishop Barron, Magna Anima, just that sort of reference, right? Instead of the little soul, you reach out to the big soul, so you can actually be spread out more. But that was just a thing I noticed with the theologian as clown. Like, where do we go? Do we go the full weird route? Right? I mean, that's Paul Kingsnorth. That's his thing. Make Christianity wild and weird. Same with Tom Holland. Don't get rid of the angels. Right? Believe all of it. Every single bit. I mean, I do. Right? I confess a belief in angels and demons. But how do we? Is that just a mere assertion of those things? And is it a forceful assertion, or is it a winsome assertion? I don't know. But there is something to the idea of we have to be aware that we're in clown's clothing, but maybe making it a little toned down or a little more stylish clown, right? We're not the clown from the 50s circus, right?
Yeah. So he puts it in contrast to that story, I guess, the story of the clown, where the clown has at complete knowledge. To this story of a priest who is floating in the ocean, but he's tied to a piece of wood, and he uses very kind of dark language there in that section. So yeah, I guess I'll maybe just go ahead and read some of it. So, fastened to the cross, with the cross fastened to nothing, drifting over the abyss. The situation of the contemporary believer could hardly be more accurately and impressively described. Only a loose plank bobbing over the void seems to hold him up, and it looks as if he must eventually sink. I mean, that's pretty. I don't know. I guess that struck me as interesting because, I mean, Ratzinger is definitely a person of great faith, but he also implies this sort of relationship between faith and doubt, and this idea that God is he uses a term properly invisible in the Christian tradition, right? So there is this mysterious kind of very unsatisfied aspect to the nature of God. And I was thinking of, maybe to tie it back to this little corner thing, the conversation that Moises and Sam Tiedemann were having about Harry Potter, and in contrast to Narnia. And I remember.
What was that exactly?
So, the conversation was mostly about Harry Potter, but one of the things that struck me was, I think it was Sam Tiedemann said, Aslan in Narnia, he's just a force. He's kind of there. He just kind of comes and goes. The only real drama is his absence or presence, right? And on one hand, he's right that as a dramatic story, maybe that he doesn't entirely work or is entirely compelling. It's certainly not novelistic in the way that modern literature is, but it's also sort of the way God's presence is treated in the scriptures, right? And where it's there, but it's also the believers go through long phases where God doesn't seem present, or they struggle with their faith, and there's not an obvious reason why.
Yeah, and you know what?
Mhm.
I think that ties in also to Ratzinger's example of Therese of Lisieux, right? That she confessed in her diaries, which apparently weren't released till quite later on, because it was people thought it was scandalous, that she suffered from temptations of atheism, right? Right up until the end. And I think he said, you know, the faith for her was as much fact as could be done, right? She lived cocooned in a Catholic bubble from the moment she was born to the moment she died. It was very real, very tangible, and still she suffered from the terrible perhaps. Perhaps it's all fake, right? It haunts the believer and the skeptic equally.
Yeah, that part was really interesting to me. I hadn't heard that story about Therese before.
I knew a little bit, but whatever it was from Barron's Catholicism series, because he does a little bit on her, right? Um,
I don't remember.
but I've not read The Little Way, right? I should,
I haven't either. I should.
right? Like everybody says you should read it, but you haven't read it yet. It's on the list. It's on the list.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there was something else here that. Yeah, before we go, what did you guys make of that? The creed both starts and ends with trust, but different trust, right? Credo and amen. What did you make of that? Because I hadn't thought about it initially until I read the book.
I don't know if I made anything of it. I thought it was an interesting point. I liked his discussion of like Greek versus Hebrew like understandings of faith, and how he doesn't see them as like all that different. I liked that discussion. I don't know, you start by believing and you end by understanding.
Yeah, he draws the connection between the term stand and understand. And he talks about Isaiah, and he also talks about a phrase of Luther. So if you do not believe, then you do not abide. And the scripture he talks about is if you do not believe, if you do not hold firm to Yahweh, then you will have no foothold. So the idea seems to be that standing or having a foundation is a metaphor for belief. So when I was thinking about this, when I read back over it, I thought of the connection between standing and the plank, as it were, in the ocean. So, and how those two images build on each other. So, and I guess maybe sometimes the the firmness you need, and it sometimes maybe it varies, and sometimes there's times when it feels less sure. But I guess in Ratzinger's formulation, it's still there, though. It's still something that brings you to God. So, Another way it's put here is if you do not believe, then you do not understand either. So, and that is an interesting formulation. It is, I guess, in that, yeah, belief and understanding are related, but I guess in the factum, the proposition comes first and then the belief, whereas he seems to purposely um, put it in opposition. So, whereas the standing in the act of faith and is comes before the intellectual belief, or at least it comes, I guess, with the intellectual ascension in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, and the funny part about that too is it's stealing a base, right? Because you're assenting to a belief before you start the observation, right? Even though you're tricking yourself into thinking that I'm standing on solid ground all the time, right? In that way, it's unlike the believer who has tied himself to the cross and is floating on the ocean. The factum, the believer in the factum rather, is basically in a state of mirage that he's standing on solid ground at all times when he's actually floating on the ocean.
Mhm.
And the moment that he comes to realize that, like, you're on a tightrope and all of a sudden you look down and you're like, oh, there's a hole there. And then immediately the mirage is broken. That's what the image was to me. I mean, we're almost at the hour. I mean,
Yeah, I know. So no, I'm just kind of thinking through. So yeah, and then so he talks about when he gets into chapter 2, the difference between philosophy and creed, which I think maybe that's a good stopping point. Where so creed. So he uses the formulation from Romans. So faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word. Or sorry, I think I feel like I screwed that up. So anyway, so
you're the prot. Come on, you know it's by heart.
Yeah, I should have it here by notes, but I don't. But but the idea is that you have so the word is something that's outside in Ratzinger's formulation. The word is something that's outside of oneself, right? So if philosophy is only meditation or only knowledge of oneself, then the creed is a formula that brings someone into a community. And so no, and maybe I'll just go ahead and read it. There was a section here at the end where I was kind of thinking, like, oh man, it sounds like he's well, I don't know. It seemed applicable to this little corner. So so he was talking about the philosopher well, if I screw the name up, forgive me, but Marius Victorinus. And apparently, so he was a Platonist, and Augustine had found out that he became a Christian. And with that, he, I guess it made Augustine rethink what was going on and happening. And so, anyway, so the in here, so it's like many educated people, both then and now, he saw the church as Platonism for the people, something of which he, as a full-blown Platonist, had no need. The decisive factor seemed to him to be the idea alone. Only those who could not grasp it themselves, as the philosopher could in its original form, needed to be brought into contact with it through the medium of ecclesiastical organization. I was thinking about that. It's like, wow, I think that really speaks to a lot of what goes on. Whereas the idea is, I think one of the temptations for people who, I don't know, may read a book like Introduction to Christianity is the idea of the private truth, or the idea that I can assent to these truths without a community. But the creed, by definition, brings someone into a faith and into a belief together, and it gives them something to stand on, in the language of the book. So.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say? It's the difference between, studying it in your basement versus the person who just goes out is going to get the same thing, and he didn't have to do that work.
So, so for myself and for Emma, I guess we've both been fairly involved with religious communities to a certain extent for most of our lives. But so I guess, what did you find, Mark, though? I guess I'm curious, as someone who might have been like reading or thinking about these things when you had, I guess, the embodied experiences, so to speak.
Well, I think I almost felt it the most the moment I stopped going because COVID stopped it. Right?
Yeah.
The moment that because I had made a commitment to myself to go to Mass for about, I think I said 12 to 18 months before I made any decisions. Because I remember watching some video where James Lindsay goes on about the born again thing only lasts 18 months at most. Right? I'm like, okay, you know what? Fair game. I'll put the money down. I'll do it for 18 months. We'll see where it goes. And it was really interesting to start getting up in the morning and going somewhere on Sunday morning, every single Sunday, as opposed to, I'm just watching YouTube thinky talky videos, and that's how I get my philosophy. Ooh,
Enough.
Enough. Go. Get off your butt. Go now. Now. Right? Literally, yeah. I mean, it becomes embodied, and it's not something you can really fully propositionalize over again, because it is something that's only understood in person, right? And then you start getting tangled up in the community, right? I think I said somewhere that one of the moments that I knew that I was actually part of the community was when some random woman came up to me and asked me about some administrative thing going on in the parish, because she assumed I knew what was going on because she saw me there all the time and saw me lecturing and ushering, that I must know what the hell was going on. That's not true. But it was at that point I realized I'd become part of a community, right? Where I hadn't. And that change happened slowly. I mean, I sat at the back for Mass for 2 years, and I had, here's something not great about Catholic parishes. I had one person say hello in 2 years.
It's really easy to just sneak in, go to Mass, and sneak out and not talk to anyone the whole time.
Yeah. The only reason he said hello, he recognized me from when I was at co-op at his department. Right? That's the only reason. Otherwise, no one would have said hello to me. Not once.
When you go to Mass, do you walk the stations and pray most of the time? Or?
I have a kid.
Okay, fair enough.
I have a kid. I let him run up and down the halls as many times as possible until it starts, and then the fighting starts with him. Sometimes. Sometimes he's a good boy. Other times...
Is he like 2?
2.5. Yep. Not
It's
old
a
enough.
Tricky age.
Not old enough yet to really get what's going, to have any idea. It's just he's getting stuck in a pew, and he doesn't like that. He doesn't like being confined anywhere. So, I mean, even as a baby, he wouldn't let him swaddle him. Like, he wouldn't be swaddled.
Free spirit.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I was having a conversation with someone who had been watching some of her Reiki and some of PVK's videos, and he, I couldn't tell honestly what exactly he had wanted from me. It was kind of an,
Hmm.
because I couldn't tell if because he kept going back to this question of how do you believe? And I mean, the first thing I would say, and I guess maybe it sounds very Protestant, though I know Ratzinger says something similar and presents belief in a similar way, which is that I can't make anyone believe, right? So, um, but I guess if you be- feel like believing is a goal, then yeah, well, go to church, go to, if you're Catholic, go to Mass, say the creed. I mean, walk the stations. I mean, do things that are, that you can't do by yourself, right? I mean, I think that's important. Or, I mean, if you're Protestant, ask someone to pray for you because I guess those things do, in a real way, far more to bolster my faith, I know, than any of the sort of thinky talky things do, though they are in conversation with each other. And I guess I don't quite understand it all the time, but I do know it for myself, and I imagine it's probably something similar for the both of you, that having abstract ideas will reinforce what are sometimes fairly simple concepts and make them more vivid in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, for me, just speaking about the mass, the propositions, the more of them I know, it informs the participatory and even makes me understand the perspectival aspect, right? Like when you kneel during the consecration, that it means so much more when I realized why I was kneeling. And then the kneeling just reinforced that. And it showed me who I was in perspective to the Lord, being, you know, behold the Lamb of God being raised up above us. Right. And then above him is the crucifix. It's just so perfect. And it just narratively fits. And like I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it, actually. It's kind of crazy. But it's totally true. Those propositions inform. And then when you do it, they reinforce again the proposition you learned at the beginning. It's such an interesting way to look at it. You're right.
Uh, yeah, so um, yeah, no, it's definitely true, and yeah, so maybe I'll finish out the video by reading some of the portion where he talks about the idea of standing. So, I mean, I guess maybe 2 seconds here. I should have had it queued up, I guess. And
We're professionals.
yeah, well, no one's gonna accuse us of that. So
Parents thought.
yep. So, but yeah. So um, 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 so the one root word men, amen, embraces a variety of meaning whose interplay and differentiation goes to make up the subtle grandeur of this sentence. It includes the meaning, truth, firmness, firm ground, and furthermore, the meaning loyalty to trust. Entrust oneself, take one's stand on something, believe in something. Thus, faith in God appears as holding on to God through which man gains a firm foothold for his life. Faith, therefore, is defined as taking up a position, as taking a stand, trustfully on the ground of the Word of God.
Yeah, that's a great place to have it.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for joining me tonight. And so I'll definitely look forward to doing it again.
Thank you.
I can't wait to read the next part that I was supposed to read for today, apparently.
Sounds great.